So compassion, as many other words, comes from the Latin. In this case, it means to suffer with. And to suffer with doesn't mean that we're experiencing the same hardships or the same mental or physical anguish that the other person may be feeling, but there's a sense of empathy. There's a sense of being willing to suffer with, being willing to feel into the hurt of the other person, even though we know that it's, we can't fully feel, the physicality of whatever pain or distress the other person might be feeling. Giving ourselves, it's an outpouring towards another in a time of need, or maybe just in general that happens. So this sense of compassion, we're not taking sides, right? We're not saying that what's happening to the other person is right or wrong, or we agree with it or don't, or it should happen or it shouldn't be happening, or it's not fair, or we're just lending our empathy, lending our attention, lending our presence to the situation. So it's not something that we're doing to fix the other person, right? We're not doing for, to necessarily even make it better. It's just the natural thing to do. It's actually not something that we do. It's something that we are. That sense of caring for another human, caring for another group of humans, maybe caring for our culture or society as a whole, for whatever it may be going through. So, tonight we can be talking both on the individual level as well as the societal level, in terms of having compassion for the suffering that may be happening. So I know in spiritual traditions, practicing compassion is often emphasized, and that's good. That's helpful. It may lead us to be able to sense into, being in the other person's shoes, feeling something other than our own interests. So that's helpful, but I'd suggest it's actually not the true compassion. If we're being compassionate because we, think it's a valid spiritual practice, and we're doing our spiritual practice because we feel like there's a benefit to ourselves, of course, by doing such a practice, then it's not really true compassion. Nisargadatta talked about conscious merit is mere vanity, right? So if we're doing it with the sense of I am being compassionate, I'd suggest that we can't both be compassionate and feel like I am being compassionate at the same time. It's one or the other. If we're really compassionate, the I sense is really absent. We're just with the other. And that's actually the value of it. So the spiritual practice is worthy because it shows us the possibility of what it can truly become. So that's helpful to point in that direction. But the actual true compassion is when it's no longer a practice. It's just an outpouring of what we are, what we know ourselves to be, but it's not done from a personal perspective at all. So we can look at sort of two really broad, crudely defined categories of human suffering. So the first category would be the inevitable. The second category would be that where the cause could be seen to a certain degree. So in terms of that suffering that is inevitable in one's life, I mean, things that come to mind readily are, old age and sickness and death, inevitable consequences of being alive. As individuals and as societies, we essentially decide that that's an acceptable degree of suffering. Not that it's fun, not that it's pleasant, not that it doesn't hurt, not that it doesn't grieve us when someone else that we know or love is going through that. But we can also see that it is as life is. And by choosing to continue to live in the immensity and beauty and joy and possibilities of this lifetime, that's one of the payments that go along with the deal. But it's not just, end of life things that are inevitable. I'd suggest even things that happen throughout our life that can be very challenging at the time, but are sort of like rites of passage, so we can think of things like even learning to walk, ask for the first time ever, asking someone out on a date, and taking a chance of being rejected by that person, going to our first job interview, childbirth, coming to the end of a enjoyable career, watching the kids leave home, watching our parents age. All these things are difficult, challenging, although the facts may vary, that all of us have been through those or similar kinds of situations in this lifetime. And we take it as just, yes, that's how life is. So, there's no apparent cause, there's no blame, there's no, it's just how life unfolds. And it can still be difficult. We can still offer our compassion when, somebody's going through difficult times such as these. But there's also a sense of, I too will have those experiences or quite similar. So there's a sense of, yes, it's inevitable, it's difficult, it's challenging, may cause grief, but it's also an inevitable part of life. Okay, so the second one is where we'll focus on, as you might imagine. So the second kind is caused, and we can say, well, everything has an infinite number of causes, or some other people might say, well, everything just happens, which is just another way of saying the same thing. That's true, but we're simplifying to a degree here and saying that there's certain, discernible causes for suffering that we may experience. Okay, so an example is probably appropriate. So, if we, find ourselves going through a difficult divorce, we find challenges in the workplace dealing with other people. We've been through trauma in our lives, whether in childhood or teenagehood or even adulthood. Those are examples of personal situations where we can see that there was a cause, whether in ourselves or in others, that contributed to or led to this particular suffering, this hardship. But we can also easily look around and turn on the news any night, and we'll find any number of examples of societal suffering, whether it's about the atmosphere warming or racial inequities or unfair distribution of wealth, poisoning of our waterways, deterioration of our soils, contamination of our food supplies, not to mention wars of various kinds. So these are all possibilities of things that are caused that we can trace back and see some cause. And what we might notice that all the things I just mentioned, both on a personal level and on a societal level, as problems facing our civilization, actually our planet today, are all of the man-made variety. Right? These are problems that we as a race have created and imposed on both ourselves as well as other species in the world itself. So we're talking about human-created causes that now cause not only ourselves, but everyone else to suffer. We don't want to go too directly to compassion. We need to really investigate the underlying causes of this before we can address compassion. So I would say that the underlying cause has to do with ignorance. By that, I don't mean stupidity. I just mean ignorance of who we truly are. And what we take ourselves to be is separate from everything else. We take ourselves to be a separate individual entity, a separate person, me, separate from everything else, separate from all other people, all other plants and animals, everything else. I would suggest that this is a root cause for our situation. And we can see the consequences of this ignorance, especially over the last 400 or 500 years, the Industrial Revolution, the quickening of the pace of civilization, more and more advances in technology, everything speeded up. As a result, there's this movement, this personal movement that comes out of desire and hope and ambition and fear that is trying to manipulate circumstances in our environment for my benefit, right? As long as we take ourselves to be this separate individual person, why not manipulate our environment to my advantage, to make life more pleasant, more comfortable, maybe more safe, maybe more exciting, whatever avenue we believe will enhance our sense of self, right? It's often easier to see this movement in other people. We look out on the world and we see people or organizations or political parties or corporations that we see as perpetrators of this inequity, perpetrators of this division, judgment of others. And so it's easy to look out and point the finger there and say, well, they shouldn't be doing this. And the sense of it is, if only everyone else would just listen to what I know to be true, then, hey, the world would be a better place, right? And how can I say that? Well, because I know that's right. Why? Because that's my opinion. I've thought about it and I've come to that conclusion. And, so there's a sense of I'm right and they're wrong. I'm good and they are not, right? This is called division. So the difficulty is, there's 8 billion other people all doing the same thing, all having different beliefs, but all sort of equally certain that their beliefs are quite correct. The underlying movement of this certainty is our fascination with our thinking mind. So the thinking mind in humans is a relatively recent development. in evolutionary terms. So we're still getting the hang of it, right? So what we've learned that it's really good at is it's good to think logically, and the mind is quite good at doing that. It's good at seeing differences, nearly as good as seeing commonalities, right? We tend to see differences between races rather than commonalities among all people. And this fascination with our mind leads us to always look for the next thing, always invent something new, always be willing to sort of demand more of life than life may be offering at the moment, always pushing forward. And the pace of that has become ever and ever faster. So the consequences of that also have been multiplying. So these issues that we can easily name in terms of climate change and population pressures and degradation of the soil and poisoning of the waterways, etc., are all consequences of wanting, the argument is wanting a better life for everybody, but, primarily for me, right? If our view is that I am a separate person, that view, may be modified with a certain degree of spiritual practice. But at the end of the day, when the chips are down, we will choose that course of action in our favor, as long as we believe that what I am is the separate self. We can try to be more selfless and think more about other people. That's nice. But as long as deep down in our heart of hearts, we believe that, yes, but, at the end of the day, I'm really a separate person, then we'll act from that perspective. So when we see something in the other person or a group of people or, politicians or corporate executives that we don't like, we feel entitled to, be angry or be anxious or be furious or whatever our reaction may be. And of course, if we agree with them, then we're happy with that. So we tend to not only listen to the other person or observe what's happening, but we inject our own opinions about what's there. And we do that because we believe that our judgment and our opposition to what we feel shouldn't be happening is essential, right? Our only response might be to, become anxious or to become angry. But we feel like, well, I don't want to just give that up. The world's in a bad enough place as it is, but at least I am, holding the last straw of it together by my opposition. If I gave in, then, who knows what would happen? The whole world would fall apart. Right? So there's somehow the belief that that my opposition is required. But what actually is happening? What's actually happening is we're using our life energy, sort of building up this emotional surge that has, if there's no action after that, it's just building up this emotional surge that's draining our energy for any other activities. So it's not of any benefit to ourselves personally, other than the sense of, well, at least I'm on the right side. But I'd suggest it also has no net benefit to the issue at large, because our opposition reinforces it. Our opposition creates more division. Our opposition energizes the opposition. Right? It's very much like happens in our own mind when we take a position opposite a thought or a feeling that we may be sensing in our own body, and we don't agree with it, we don't like it being there, we try to get rid of it, it reinforces it. That's how things work. There's a very familiar psychological saying that says, whatever we resist persists. Right? If we resist a thought, we energize it. We agree with it, we energize it. Either one works, right? So it's the same when we look out at the world and see something that we don't agree with. Our opposition energetically reinforces it, reinforces that division. And so that's why, politicians, don't mind the conflict. They need people to get fired up, and the best way to do that is to have an opponent. Right? So that whole movement strengthens that division. And a lot of people think that, well, the answer to that is to have a charismatic strong man in charge, right? And we can look around the world, and there's a lot of movement in that direction politically. The thinking, I believe, is that well, as disorderly as things are, what we really need is someone just to take charge, right? And I'm willing to give up some freedom in order to have that orderliness. That'll be the solution. All of this is trying to resolve things on the outside. None of anything that we've talked about so far has anything to do with inner work, introspection, none of that. We're just saying the other person's wrong, I know that they are, and what can I do about it? As if we, sort of put things in order on the outside, to the point where I felt comfortable and safe, and that people were generally in agreement with how I saw things, then problem solved, right? So we're looking, to solve the problem on a social level. Right? But as Nisargadatta said, if we demand peace in the world, but deny it in ourselves, we'll never find it. So this sense of opposition, one of the things in when Gandhi was opposing the British in 1947 or so, the British had been in India for 100 years, 150 years, well established, one of the most powerful empires in the world at that time, although they were on the decline. Still, very ominous presence in India. And, Gandhi was very clear over and over again that he was not against the British, but he was for independence for India. Big difference, right? So just the opposition isn't really helpful. It's like, what are you for? So we can easily take the attitude of that's wrong, that shouldn't be happening, that's not right, that's not fair, that's destroying the planet. Somebody ought to do something about it. Created this upset, this turmoil within ourselves, and we expect someone else to act on our behalf in a way that will resolve the problem. Maybe we're willing to, we might very easily be willing to get angry. Maybe if we're really motivated, we might write a letter or show up at a protest. Maybe if we're very angry enough, who knows, we might resort to violence to seize power, or, drive a vehicle into a crowd of protesters, or who knows what, or fly planes into buildings. It's actually just a matter of degree. And this was exactly what Eckhart Tolle was talking about. He had a retreat um, just that started just several days after 9/11. And the retreat was up at Omega. And of course, one of the questions that people asked was, about the tragedy of 9/11. And what he said was very interesting. He said that certainty in the mind of the Islamic suicidal hijackers differed only in degree from others of us that, have certainty, but, aren't quite willing to act on it to that degree, not willing to kill themselves for it, right? Some people are, right? Many people are, in wars past in this country were willing to fight for an idea, fight for a cause, and, sometimes very justifiably, sometimes maybe not. But Eckhart's point was just, if we can sense into that same movement in ourselves, that movement that of certainty, I know I'm right, I know how things should be. We can see that, of course, we wouldn't go to that extreme, right? But we could see that same movement at work, that, some movement where we take some kind of action for our own benefit that may negatively impact somebody else. I mean, it can, obviously not as dramatic as that, but perhaps, we just sort of maneuver our way in the business world to get promoted ahead of some other person, or we, pursue a mate when we know someone else is quite interested, or we, those kind of things. We might find ourselves taking some action to our benefit and maybe to someone else's detriment. So we can see the same movement. It's helpful to see it, and the degree of malfeasance might be totally out of proportion one to the other. But it's good to see that same possibility of movement in ourselves, because that's the first sort of willingness to look inward rather than outward in the sense of blame. When we look inward, when we become willing to look inward, creates the possibility of breaking that chain of karma, that chain of causation. And that willingness to look is the first step. Nisargadatta again talks about the unwillingness to investigate our own patterning perpetuates it, right? If we're unwilling to look, that same patterning that may have caused ourselves and other people's difficulty in life will tend to persist, will tend to go on until we're willing to look at it. So this is that inward motion. So if there's no introspection, that war, either in our own head or with other people or with us in society, will tend to perpetuate. So the possibility at this time, always really, but particularly important at this time, is the recognition of what we truly are as awareness. As awareness that is not personal. It's not a personal awareness. It's not myself being aware. It's just awareness. And the recognition of that takes us out of the source of this movement, gaining, seizing power and things and fame and accomplishment, attainments for myself. It gets us out of that loop because it's not relevant. When awareness is discovered as being what we truly are, those other things seem like not that important. It's still nice when some things accomplished, but it's not, we no longer hold the belief when that's accomplished, then I will be happy, then I will be elevated somehow. That's what's lost, because that awareness, it feels complete in itself. It's not lacking anything. It's not seeking anything for its improvement. Willing to witness everything, willing to be there for all of life's events, just without that sense of grasping onto the next thing, always pushing the envelope further, always wanting more, that movement. And that movement, I would suggest, is the fundamental core for those consequences of human behavior that are becoming ever more clear. So this movement to discover our true self, our original self, our true being, as awareness, is possible. It's possible in this lifetime. And we've made such evolutionary jumps as a species in the past. There was a point in our distant past where we were conscious, just like all other animals are conscious, but we weren't self-aware. We didn't recognize ourselves as being separate. We didn't sort of reflect back on ourselves. We were just functioning, aware of what was happening around us, but we didn't self-reflect on ourselves as being separate or being an individual. So there was a transition from consciousness to the ability to self-reflect. And we can only imagine, of course, but clearly there was some vague notion, and a few individuals might have begun to see that in some way, and then maybe some years later they might have tried to explain it to somebody else. And it probably at that time might have sounded as as downright silly as talking about no self and awareness does today to a lot of people. But at the time, maybe a few more people understood it, and then over some maybe generations, maybe thousands of years, enough people recognized it that then it became sort of common knowledge, and everybody said, "Oh yeah, that's right," and then everybody realized it. As today, nobody doubts a human's ability to self-reflect on themselves. It's so common that we don't even think about it. We don't really even talk about it. It's just as natural as can be. There's also a similar evolution from being able to function non-verbally, non-conceptually, into the development of a conceptual mind. That again probably took place over, many, many years, eons, long time. But it was a development, an evolutionary step that, to where we are today, where we are able to cognitively imagine and think and communicate and talk and write and do science and do mathematics. All of that came out of that transcendent to a new, deeper understanding about ourselves. Much more recently, there was another example of, back in the Middle Ages, sometimes Copernicus figuring out that the Earth actually rotated around the sun rather than the Earth was the center of the universe, as people, especially people in the church at the time, believed. This was a radical change, sort of a decentralization of our imagined place in the universe, a diminishment. A lot of people didn't like that, but it did give us a more realistic view, an appropriate sort of humbleness. That, of course, that's been overcome by our hubris at this point, our certainty and our intelligence, to the point that we think, even though all of these problems have arisen over the past 300 or 400 or 500 years, that we'll just keep going in the same direction. We'll just run faster, invent things at an ever more rapid pace, and we'll be able to outrun it, fix it. I once had someone, we were talking about honeybees and agriculture and the difficulties of honeybees are experiencing, and this person's solution was that we'd have a gazillion little drones that would run around and pollinate flowers, and that would be the solution. Could happen, I suppose, but it just seems like a really arrogant perspective. Okay, so as we're talking about this evolutionary jump that is required at this time, it is really to discover our true nature. That is the only solution. It's not going to happen from the government, the electing the right politicians, passing the right laws, filing, winning lawsuits. Now, those are all Band-Aid measures, and Band-Aids are fine because they buy us a little time. But the real underlying resolution is the discovery of what we truly are, that we're not separate. We're not separate from each other. When that's understood, the motivation to enhance ourselves, value our own objectives over the others, that just doesn't make sense anymore. When we see that, in essence, what we are and what the other person is this same undifferentiated awareness that has no boundaries. It has actually no point of origin. It is how all of us experience everything that we've ever experienced. Now, as that awareness enlivens and filters through our conditioning that we've all gotten a very generous dose of over the course of a lifetime, it emerges in speech and actions in different ways. Sometimes another person's conditioning agrees with ours. We like that. Sometimes it doesn't, and we really object to it. But in all cases, that conditioning was the result of certain set of circumstances that happened throughout our life. When we look back on those, we can see how happenstance they really were. The family that we were born into, the country that we were born into, the race that we were born into, the schools that we went to, the friends that we had, et cetera, all led to, a certain set of experiences from which we concluded things about ourselves and the world, all of which led to how we feel about ourselves today, how we act today, what we believe in today, what our opinions are today. So, if we begin to judge someone else's actions or speech, we really have to look at how that evolved and see how, see the degree to which it was unchosen, any more than our own patterning was unchosen. It happened. We can see that we could try to say, well, no, I really chose to, study hard in college, or, try to get a better job, or worked hard, but we can, if we're really willing to look at that, we can see how much of those things were created by earlier set of circumstances, or, patterning ourselves after our parents or a friend or a mentor, which also happened to be a matter of chance. So if we can really see that and see the degree to which, we've had to work ourselves to uncover our own non-functional conditioning, perhaps we can see our way to being compassionate to the other person that may have had a much different, perhaps much less fortunate set of conditions that they were up through. What is felt as this great sorrow of compassion is to look at this whole set of conditioning in other people and how that plays out, both as individuals or as groups or as whole society, and look at that and just sense into the unnecessariness of it. You know, the great sorrow is to see that if those individuals or that society could see through it, you know, these issues, these problems that are created could be avoided. The great sorrow is they can't really be avoided because they're the result of the conditioning. If we can see through them, yes, but the issue is whether we can see through them or not. That's where the work has to be done. Until then, those patterns go on repeating, the opposition remains. You know, it's almost as if we are, you know, a moth in the flame, you know, where we're still fighting the 100-year war that was started by somebody stealing a chicken, you know, and it goes back and forth until we've lost sight of what the commonality originally was. So the sadness is just seeing the unnecessary nature of this whole movement. But it's not actually avoidable because that's what's happening at the moment. We can see it's unnecessary, but it is necessary based on the fact that it is happening. So it's not really avoidable. It could be avoidable if we could see through it, but we can't see through it. That's the sadness. It's possible. You know, if there was nothing we can do about it, you know, sort of like life's inevitabilities, there's nothing we can do about it. It doesn't grab us in quite the same way. But when we can see that it's actually unnecessary, it's actually, you know, we're pulled into it by our own folly, by our own neediness, by our own seeking to fulfill this inner lack. That movement played out in a million ways, ends up causing pain for ourselves and other people. And it's all happening as a result of ignorance. We don't know any better. You know, so that's also the basis for compassion, to see that it's not willful in that sense. We just don't know any better, so we act out of our conditioning, you know, in quite predictable ways in many cases. And right now it seems like life is trying to get our attention, you know, saying, you're not on the right path here, folks. And seems like it's doing that in the form of pandemics and floods and fires and warming trends and hurricanes and dissension, etc. So the question is, can we listen? You know, our usual sense is, well, I hope somebody else is doing something about it. I hope they're listening. But, you know, can we listen? Can we see our own participation in that? Because that's something that we do have control over. You know, we can just feel a sense of helplessness if we expect other people to, you know, fix the issue, but are unwilling to do anything about it ourselves. So by really being willing to look inside in a sustained, courageous, willing kind of way and just see where that leads, then there's a possibility for ourselves to find peace. We can find it in ourselves, then we can perpetuate it in the world. We can effectuate it in the world. If we can't find it in ourselves, how will we help? So, before we even think about sort of helping, fixing the world, we need to get to the point where we're quite certain that we're not doing harm. We're not adding to the problem. And the only way we can be clear about that is to really look closely at our intentions, where they're coming from. If they're coming from the personal self, the sense of me is separate from everything out there, they're going to be misguided. If they're coming more from a sense of awareness and a sense of what's best for this situation as a whole, what's the highest and best good for all involved, then they're more likely to be of value. So that's the one thing that we have power to do. We have the power to change ourselves. But we have the power to do the responsibility as well. We don't have the responsibility to do what we don't have the power to do. But we do have the responsibility to do what we do have the power to do.